Happy Sunday, everybody. I begin with a question of why do Mormons revere Abraham Lincoln? I teased this particular musing a few musings ago when I made mention that C.S. Lewis was the second most quoted non-Mormon in General Conference for the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, to which someone quipped in the comments, oh, well, wouldn't that be Jesus? Who technically, I guess, was not at the time Mormon, as we now know and understand the term. But leaving that remark aside, C.S. Lewis was the second most quoted individual, and I mentioned in that musing that Abraham Lincoln was the first. So today's musing is, why do members of the church and leaders of the church revere Abraham Lincoln the way that they do? You know, we sing praise to the man, and we talk about Joseph Smith, but man, Abraham Lincoln gets a lot of praise himself. I've identified 132 references to and quotes of Abraham Lincoln in General Conference. Again and again and again, he's being quoted. For example,
I'm fond of this bit of wisdom by Abraham Lincoln.
Abraham Lincoln was right when he said,
it comes from Abraham Lincoln, who said.
When speaking of his mother, President David O. McKay quoted Abraham Lincoln, saying,
Abraham Lincoln wisely said,
Abraham Lincoln once asked,
I appreciate the counsel of Abraham Lincoln, who said.
Now, in these examples, they're mostly quoting various little remarks of Abraham Lincoln's. It's no question that he has some good quotes, some good, statements, some speeches and so forth, that he was an eloquent individual and quite loquacious. But, he's left a lot of quotes that people will recite in General Conference and elsewhere. So of that, we can't question it. However, in General Conference and by church leaders, there have been far more substantive remarks regarding Abraham Lincoln and his actions, not just echoing his fanciful words. There's a BYU journal called Religious Educator, and in an article that they published about Abraham Lincoln and his perception among members of the church, they said, modern general authorities appreciate and delight in the words of Abraham Lincoln because they help portray gospel concepts in an imaginative and practical manner that appeals to common people. So this is the explanation given for why so many general authorities quote the words of Abraham Lincoln. But what about his actions and his behavior? As I mentioned, there are plenty of those remarks as well. The first president of the church to favorably remark about Abraham Lincoln's actions and call him inspired in what he did was Joseph F. Smith in 1906, who pointed out that Christ had inspired all the great philosophers, and he threw Lincoln into this bunch. He called Lincoln, he said that Lincoln was guided in emancipation and union. We'll get to that in just a second. Okay, 1940, Heber Grant, as president of the church, says, every Latter-day Saint believes that Abraham Lincoln was raised up and inspired of God, and that he reached the presidency of the United States under the favor of our Heavenly Father. We honor Abraham Lincoln because we believe absolutely that God honored him and raised him to be the instrument in his hands of saving the Constitution and the Union. Of course, Heber Grant, if you recall, well, if I said this in a musing, I've at least written it in my book, Latter-day Liberty, A Gospel Approach to Government and Politics, which was the first book I've written. In that book, I talk about how President Grant was a huge prohibitionist, that he was the kind of leading advocate behind prohibition in the United States, and consequently had a bit of an authoritarian streak, wanting to boss people around and dictate behavior. And so perhaps no surprise why he is championing the cause of Abraham Lincoln, but it's odd that he says every Latter-day Saint believes that he was raised up and inspired of God, etc., and that we, the Latter-day Saints, believe absolutely that God raised him to be the instrument in his hands of saving the Constitution and the Union. Again, we're going to unpack this a little bit. Final quote, well, actually, two more. George Albert Smith, I think he said this as an apostle. I had a hard time sourcing this quote, but multiple reputable sources were all quoting from this apparent book or tract that he wrote. I just couldn't find the original. But this is apparently George Albert Smith. He says, that was the voice of him now stilled in death, Abraham Lincoln, who gave his life because of his desire for the perpetuation of the liberty that was guaranteed under the Constitution of the United States. He was unafraid. When the duty was placed upon him to battle for the liberties of mankind, he dedicated his life to that purpose. And in due time, our Father in heaven accepted his offering, and his name is emblazoned upon the pages of history as a great and noble man who dared to do right, and his praises will be sung and his virtues extolled throughout all time. Now, of course, you've probably heard, as I have, that Abraham Lincoln was one of the many kind of early founders and leaders of the country who appeared to Wilford Woodruff in the temple saying, hey, you got to do our ordinances and you got to do our temple work. So, did that story really happen? What are the circumstances of that? We're going to get to that towards the end of the musing, but it kind of relates to this overall near deification or glorification of Abraham Lincoln by leaders of the church in particular. Here is George Smith saying that he battled for the liberties of mankind, that the Father in heaven accepted his offering. His name is emblazoned upon the pages of history as a great and noble man who dared to do right. And then here's Bishop Edgley.
Abraham Lincoln, who freed the slaves, led the United States through a civil war, and eventually unified the country.
This is historical whitewashing. It's no question that Abraham Lincoln was a good speaker and orator and writer, right? He had left a bunch of, impactful quotes and little things that he said and did that people can quote, sure. But his actions and what actually transpired under his presidency, the course of political machinations that he oversaw and directly instituted himself, are quite different than what everyone is taught in their fourth grade social studies textbook. And it leads to quotes like this: he freed the slaves and eventually unified the country. Historical whitewashing. Let's unpack both. Freeing the slaves. Okay, that's what President Lincoln, Abraham Lincoln, is most known for and revered for, the Great Emancipator, right? Well, what is that? He directly instituted the Emancipation Proclamation, which took effect January 1st, 1863. This proclamation did not free the slaves, as most people understand that term, as Bishop Edgley alluded to, that he freed the slaves. It did not free the slaves. It only freed slaves in certain areas. It only extended to states of the Confederacy that had seceded that were not already controlled by the Union. So where it was intended to imply, the Emancipation Proclamation, right, where it was intended to apply, it couldn't free a single slave. But it did not apply to the several border slave states where it could have freed the slaves, where the Union had already kind of regained control and reclaimed authority. This Emancipation Proclamation was really a wartime propaganda measure. It was intended to buoy up support for the war, including internationally, trying to discourage any European support for the Confederacy, much like the French helped the colonists against England. Many in the South were trying to solicit European support, replicating that same pattern for the Confederacy against the kind of aggressive tactics of the North. So the Emancipation Proclamation becomes a bit of a propaganda measure trying to deter that European support. And then eventually, as Union armies began to occupy more and more Southern territory, the proclamation began slowly to be turned into reality. Thousands of slaves were set free as federal Union troops advanced. But by no means was this, with the stroke of a pen, the slaves were freed. After the war, what fully and actually freed the slaves was what is now the 13th Amendment. In 1865, 27 of the 36 states ratified the 13th Amendment, which abolished slavery. And, Steven Spielberg has his Lincoln film that came out, and in that film, Lincoln is portrayed as leveraging his political expertise and currency, his political currency, to try and get the 13th Amendment passed, to try and abolish slavery. That's simply not true. Lincoln, if anything, was a reluctant supporter of this 13th Amendment. The most authoritative biography on Lincoln is written by David Donald from Harvard. This is a 545-page tome, his magnum opus. This is a guy who's won a bunch of Pulitzer Prize awards for his writings on history. So this is like the authoritative biography of Lincoln. And in that biography, one learns that not only did Lincoln not lift a finger to help the genuine abolitionists who were really trying to agitate and push for this constitutional amendment, He even refused to help them when they went up to him and asked him for help. Lincoln was not this ardent supporter. He was not this great abolitionist. He was a calculating political leader who didn't see an opportunistic circumstance in which to join the abolitionist cause. So Spielberg completely got it wrong, and Lincoln was not the great emancipator as Bishop Edgley and others claim him to be. He didn't even really support that much the 13th Amendment that finally abolished slavery. Now, he had some personal objections to it, and he kind of felt icky, and he didn't like slavery. From time to time, he'd say these things in letters and so forth, even though his actions, as we'll get into in just a second, contrast against that. But here he is reluctantly supporting what became, without his political influence, the 13th Amendment. But Abraham Lincoln did use his political currency and energy in support of a previous potential 13th Amendment, and one that was quite opposite to the one that eventually passed. March 2nd, 1861, Congress passes an amendment to the U.S. Constitution, and it says, and I quote, "No amendment shall be made to the Constitution which will authorize or give to Congress the power to abolish or interfere with any state with the domestic institutions thereof, including that of persons held to labor or service by the laws of said state." That is March 2nd of 1861. Lincoln had arrived in Washington, D.C. a couple weeks prior. He's actively lobbying behind the scenes to drum up support for this amendment. He's trying to, one last Hail Mary to, after he got elected, the southern states are like, we're out of here. We're not going to tolerate this. So he's trying to, avoid war. He's trying to reclaim the states. He's trying to show them like, hey, we'll leave slavery alone and we'll do you one better. We will put it in the Constitution and forever protect your ability in your state to do slavery. So Lincoln himself is involved in lobbying for this constitutional amendment. 2 days after Congress passes it, Abe Lincoln takes office, March 4th. He gives his inaugural address. In that address, he notes that Congress has just approved what's called the Corwin Amendment, but this constitutional amendment, and said in his address, quote, that he had no objection to its being made express and irrevocable. So he's saying, I'm not opposed to this constitutional amendment. I'm not opposed to making slavery expressly authorized in the Constitution and irrevocable, because the amendment said that that amendment could never be abolished or interfered with. And so this statement, "Oh, I do not object," is a lukewarm public statement, meant, frankly, to mask his true efforts behind the scenes where he's lobbying in favor of this amendment. So the supposed great emancipator was willing to use slaves as a pawn to stop secession. And the president, who is now remembered for abolishing slavery, was willing to constitutionally protect it if doing so would preserve the Union. So no, he did not, quote unquote, free the slaves. Right? This was Congress. This was the abolitionists agitating for what became actually the 13th Amendment. Lincoln is not really a big supporter, but he was supporter of a prior amendment that would have forever sanctioned slavery in the United States Constitution. And so, Ohio ratified that previous amendment. Maryland ratified it. The war then was launched and it got kind of lost, but it is still technically and legally a pending amendment. And if for whatever reason a number of other states started to ratify it, that would create a huge constitutional crisis to figure out how that intersects with the other, 13th Amendment. So it's still an actual pending amendment, as are many other amendments that were passed by Congress but not ratified by a sufficient number of states. So Lincoln, he's married to a woman who is the daughter of one of the biggest slave plantation owners in Kentucky. And she inherits the slaves of her father, but laws being what they were at the time, she could not own them. They were transferred over to the ownership of Abraham Lincoln. They became property of Abraham Lincoln under the law. He could have freed these slaves if he so detested slavery, but he instructed his attorneys to sell them into slavery somewhere else, which they did, which I think speaks far more to his character and his desires and his intents than some flowery language written in a letter or said to somebody else. And until his dying day, Abraham Lincoln was plotting to deport black people out of America. He thought that the two races could never mix, that there could be no equality, that they were inferior, that it was pointless to have any type of mixing of the races, and was actively looking for locations in which they could all be deported to start their own colony away from white people. Frederick Douglass, who of course is a premier abolitionist, a former slave himself, he said, and I quote, "Viewed from the genuine abolition ground, Mr. Lincoln seemed tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. But measuring him by the sentiment of his country, a sentiment he was bound as a statesman to consult, he was swift, zealous, radical, and determined." So Lincoln was no great emancipator. He only did what he did, frankly, this limited Emancipation Proclamation, as the politics changed and as it became opportune for the furtherance of his true objective, which was to, quote-unquote, preserve the Union. We'll get into that in just a second. But the point is, here Douglass is saying, like, okay, fine, if you're basing him as a politician, he's a little bit ahead of the curve in whatever, that he's consulting the people as a statesman, that he's bound to their sentiment, which true leaders aren't. True leaders shape sentiment and lead people along and inspire them to a new level of, morality or opportunity. But he's kind of wallowing along with the broader public, whereas he's saying, Frederick Douglass, that from the perspective of an abolitionist, Lincoln is tardy, cold, dull, and indifferent. So much for freeing the slaves and being a great emancipator. Okay, so let's move on to the second claim that Bishop Edgley and others like him have made, and that is that he united the country. He preserved the Union. The reality is that the war destroyed the Union as a voluntary association of states. It was truly a union before, where individual states had voluntarily assented, right? They had assented to the Union. The consent of the governed, as the Declaration makes clear. You cannot have consent without the ability to dissent. If your relationship is coerced, if you are forced to relate to somebody, you are not consenting to that relationship. If I compel a woman to be my concubine under threat or actual injury and harm, and I'm abusing her, she's not consented to that relationship. That is no kind of union. That is coercion, that is force, that is not truly a union. And that is what Lincoln's war changed. The only way that Lincoln truly preserved the Union was that he held one geographical location in political connection with another geographical location, right? Okay, great. The territory that comprises the southern states remains in a political relationship with the territory that comprises the northern states in the Union. That is not preserving the Union. That is just maintaining geographical dominance. In all other aspects, Lincoln overthrew the Union that the founders had created by undermining its foundation and core ideology, which was that it was a compact of states. You can even see this in the language. All prior to the war between the states, the United States was referred to in the plural. If you look at the Treaty of Paris, for example, after the Revolutionary War was won, the individual states are named these United States, plural. Right? Constitution, these United States. It was recognized that they were independent sovereign states that had individually assented to this relationship, but that they had to be treated independently as sovereign states. That language, that rhetoric completely changed after the war. Now, the United States is singular. It is no longer these United States. It is now the nation state, the federal government, supreme over everything else, the United States. So the union that previously existed was completely undermined, and the relationship between the federal government and the states between one another was forever changed, and no longer truly any kind of union in the functional, technical, actual sense of the word, right? We can call it a union when a pimp and a prostitute are relating to one another, that they have some kind of relationship, but it's based on fraud and coercion and immorality to force that relationship and to abuse someone to maintain the relationship. This I see as the equivalent of Joe Biden talking about unity. Here he is, and his inauguration speech, he even goes so far as to quote Lincoln. Let's take a listen.
To overcome these challenges, to restore the soul and secure the future of America, requires so much more than words. It requires the most elusive of all things in a democracy: unity. Unity. And another January, on New Year's Day in 1863, Abraham Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation. When he put pen to paper, the president said, and I quote, "If my name ever goes down into history, It'll be for this act, and my whole soul is in it. My whole soul is in it. Today, on this January day, my whole soul is in this, bringing America together, uniting our people, uniting our nation. And I ask every American to join me in this cause.
We're going to bring people together. We're going to have unity, right? And so here he is quoted just a few weeks ago in an interview with George Stephanopoulos, however you pronounce that. And he's claiming, one of my purposes in getting reelected was to unite Americans, and we got it done. Like, what kind of BS is this, right? Where he can claim that there's any kind of unity today. We don't have a union in the true sense of the term. We have subservient states to an oppressive and authoritarian federal government. The constitutional relationship is very different, and the union was not, in fact, preserved. There are claims, of course, that we're a perpetual union. The states weren't allowed to leave. Secession was illegal. The court said so. The states couldn't leave. Well, the Constitution never said any of that. The founders actually set plenty of precedent to the contrary for the state's right and power of removing itself from a political relationship with the government to which it had previously assented. The best book that I've found on the topic that I would recommend is One Nation Indivisible, A Study of Secession and the Constitution by Robert F. Hawks, Jr., chock full of quotes and good analysis that I've found useful over the years for people to understand how foolish these arguments are. For example, the Articles of Confederation, right, that predated the Constitution, the Articles themselves said that the relationship between the states forming the Confederation that confederated together, that relationship was, and I quote, a perpetual union. Constitution does not say this. The Articles of Confederation did explicitly say that this is a perpetual union. And yet, within 6 years, that confederation was dissolved. 9 of 13 states seceded from the Articles of Confederation, from the political association to which they had previously assented, to form a new union instead. The other 4, immediately upon the 9 leaving, the other 4 were disunited as a result. They were restored to complete autonomy, as in just after the Declaration of Independence. They, of course, later assented to the Union under the Constitution. But the point was that even when the founders themselves had explicitly stated that the Articles of Confederation were a perpetual union, they put that in the document itself. The very same people just a few years later were like, yeah, no, we're going to go do this other thing instead. Again and again, there is clear precedent and teaching and statements from the very architects of the Constitution and the Articles of Confederation making clear that states retain the right, the power to have that autonomy and sovereignty to dissent, to secede, to remove themselves from a union that was no longer serving their purposes. And this is something that Lincoln is fighting against. The Union is fighting against that self-determination, the very power and behavior that the previous founders had undertaken themselves. Lysander Spooner, for his part, was right. He wrote just a few years after Lincoln was doing all this. He was the author of the 1845 book, The Unconstitutionality of Slavery. So he's an abolitionist. He thinks slavery is immoral. And in 1870, so just a few years after all this is happening, he writes an essay called No Treason, in which he says that all these cries of having abolished slavery, of having preserved the Union, of establishing a government by consent, and of maintaining the national honor are all gross, shameless, transparent cheats, so transparent that they ought to deceive no one. And yet, for nearly a century and a half, they have deceived nearly everyone, thanks in large part to government schools and textbooks that glorify and honor the actions of Lincoln. They buy into the narrative that was created around him because the victors write the history. And no one is really the wiser. We'll get into that in just a second. Now, not everything was praise. Let's go back to the BYU Journal for just a second. They say that the reverence that current church leaders have for Lincoln parallels Lincoln's current national reputation among various religious, government, and social leaders. However, such respect and esteem was not given to Lincoln by general authorities who were his contemporaries. So they're saying here that modern culture and everything have shifted, and now everyone glorifies Lincoln's actions. They have this national reputation that has shifted, and just like the rest of the culture has gone along with this whitewashed narrative, so too have church leaders. But the church leaders who were around at the time had a quite different measure of respect and esteem that they paid. For example, Brigham, who was no fan of Lincoln and has lots of quotes about it, he says that Abe Lincoln was no friend of Christ. Particularly, he had never raised his voice in our favor when he was aware that we were being persecuted. Of course, he was in the Illinois legislature, Lincoln, before he was elected president. Brigham also said, if the kingdom of God was not in the way, Abraham was a pretty good man, but he acted as if he would rather the kingdom of God was out of the way. He was not the man to raise his voice in favor of Joseph Smith when his enemies were persecuting him. He, with many others, had assented to the deaths of innocent men, and through that he is subject to the influence of a wicked spirit. It's not just church leaders. David Donald, the biographer I mentioned earlier, he said, quote, to most men of his own day, Lincoln was simply a rather ineffectual president. It is hard to remember how unsuccessful Lincoln's administration appeared to most of his contemporaries. So this is very, very clearly a case of historical whitewashing, the victors writing the history, a lot of these unflattering things push down the memory hole, and we kind of glorify the actions of Lincoln because so many people want to then glorify the state, the nation state, the nationalistic perspective of federal dominance because everyone wants to benefit from its largesse. And we've moved away from the compact theory of states that confederate and unionize voluntarily together in more of a decentralized fashion. People prefer a more centralized authority. And so we see Lincoln, who was its architect, glorified and honored. Lincoln's object was not to free the slaves. It was to preserve the Union, as he called it, even though he didn't do that at all. In a letter to Horace Greeley, who was the editor of the New York Tribune, an influential newspaper, Lincoln said, my paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because I believe it helps to save the Union. And what I forbear because I do not believe it would help save the Union. This letter was written just a few months prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed some and left others alone, the third option that he said. I'm not going to get into the quotes. Lincoln has all kinds of quotes where he talks about the racial and intellectual inferiority of blacks and wanting to deport them and separation of the races. And, he says, I have no purpose directly or indirectly to interfere with the institution of slavery in the states where it exists. So people have kind of glommed onto Lincoln or imposed upon him this aura, this perception, this title, this history that frankly does not comport with what actually happened, much like Steven Spielberg's Lincoln portraying an Abraham Lincoln who was using his muscle to go fight for abolishing the slaves when the very abolitionists in charge, including Frederick Douglass, are saying that he was like a lazy bum that didn't help them at all. Clearly, history has been rewritten to favor the victor's narrative. Now, if Lincoln, as Steven Spielberg and so many books have been written about Lincoln, glorifying him and praising him and all these things. And if Lincoln was, in fact, a political genius, he should have used his genius in the way that so many other countries did to abolish slavery, namely peacefully. Instead, the slaves were used as political pawns in a war that resulted in the death of some 800,000 Americans. Now, that number seems large, but it's better understood relative to the population of the time. In fact, the 800,000-ish that died, more than double that number, were also maimed and injured for life. This number of deaths in the war between the states that Lincoln championed and furthered is the equivalent of over 8 million Americans dying today as a percentage of population. 8 million Americans, and over 15 million of them injured. A staggering number. And so the British and the Dutch and the French, the Spanish, the Danes, so many others that freed slaves, because this was not a uniquely American thing by any respect. There were all kinds of ways that they did it. There were slave rebellions, there were abolitionist campaigns, there was, electing anti-slavery politicians to kind of push for legal reform. encouragement and support of runaway slaves. There was raising private funds to purchase slaves from their masters and set them free, and then also using taxpayer dollars to buy the freedom of slaves. There were, in these different countries, some acts of violence. It's not like everything was completely copacetic and peaceful, but by and large and overwhelmingly, it was peaceful, especially by comparison to the sheer atrocity waged in the war between the states. William Wilberforce and others, right, fought to end slavery. These slaves were ultimately purchased using tax dollars to overcome the objections of the wealthy slave owners. And yes, that's expensive. And yes, that was a huge sum. But war costs way more, to say nothing of the human costs and toll. So Lincoln is not a political genius. He is furthering a political cause rather than trying to get creative and try to deal with things in other manners and other manners, yeah. And respecting the sovereignty and the self-determination of states, even for purposes that may be considered evil and immoral. There are so many other ways short of killing what is now, 8 million people in order to further your cause. So there clearly is precedent from all around the world of how to deal with this question without the results that we had in the United States. Okay, so let's finally get into this Wilford Woodruff thing, because I remember hearing when I was a kid about Lincoln and Washington and all these people, right? So Wilford Woodruff says in 1877 that he has a dream. And did Abraham Lincoln visit Wilford Woodruff in that dream with other founding fathers? No, that did not happen. The alleged dream that President Woodruff did have was only of the signers of the Declaration and Washington. Woodruff was baptized for these individuals and other, quote, eminent men and women, in his words, of which includes 100 men, 68 women. Woodruff then starts doing baptisms for the signers of the Declaration and for Washington and for these eminent men and women. There's a book called Portrait Gallery of Eminent Men and Women of the Europe and America that Woodruff had access to. So a 2-volume book. Woodruff goes to this book to start flipping through and making a list of eminent men and women to add on to the baptisms of the signers of the Declaration and Washington, who he says were the ones that visited him in the dream. Now, he skipped over many people when he compiled his list of eminent men and women, people who were in the books, 2 volumes. He skipped over Edmund Burke, Napoleon, William Wilberforce, Thomas More, Samuel Morse, Charles Dickens, Robert E. Lee. He skipped over a bunch of people. He did include in this list of people for whom he was baptized a lot of George Washington's family members, the signers of the Declaration, famous actors and actresses, authors, military leaders, poets, singers, politicians, presidents of the United States. And this is where Abraham Lincoln gets included, just in the list of all the different presidents that Wilford Woodruff decides to start doing baptisms for, not necessarily part of the eminent men. He's just like, let's do all the presidents, the ones who were no longer living. So 1877, he's in the St. George Temple. Woodruff does this baptism. And, what does this mean? Does it mean anything special? I don't think so. I mean, Hitler's temple work has even been done. Not that I condone that. In fact, that created quite a bit of controversy in the media when it was discovered. But, people can be redeemed, even horrible people, or even people ignorantly caught up in the political machinations of their day and who are launching wars that kill a bunch of innocent people for unnecessary reasons to resolve issues that could have been handled in different ways. Like, sure, fine, Abraham Lincoln gets to be baptized for the dead, or his endowment's done and so forth. Like, do I have any issues with that? I don't, because I don't think even the Abraham Lincolns of the world who, imprisoned his political opponent and who shut down papers in contravention to the First Amendment, who suspended the Constitution and did all these actions that I find totally repugnant for someone in that authority, who I believe is an authoritarian, who, despite his fancy quotes and statements that have been regurgitated by a bunch of general authorities, is revered in ways that he does not merit. That if you truly look at the facts of the situation and the unflattering aspects of what he said and did to try and better contextualize it, I don't think he should be revered and honored and glorified and deified nearly in the way that he often is by members and leaders of the church. But him being baptized or having his baptism done by Wilford Woodruff does not cause me any heartburn. I mean, in that list of eminent men and women, these actors and poets and politicians were a whole bunch of other corrupt, evil people, no doubt, breaking God's commandments and doing all kinds of other things. And yet Woodruff did their baptisms as well. He's basically just like compiling this big list of celebrities to go through and do all their baptisms. We do baptisms for everybody, right? In the temple. We don't like go through and try and investigate, were they righteous, or did I agree with their politics, or, did they abuse anyone in their family? Like, no, we go through and we just do it all. We let the Lord figure it out and them figure it out. And so it doesn't really mean anything that Abraham Lincoln's baptism was done. Okay, so the result of all of this, of Lincoln's actions, is that political power was consolidated in Washington, D.C. What before was a confederation of decentralized autonomous sovereign states has become a supreme, authoritarian, centralized government to which states are subservient. People completely misinterpret the supremacy laws of the Constitution to mean that whatever the federal government says goes, that it is the supreme law of the land, which is not what the Founders' Supremacy Clause says at all. It only says that constitutional laws are supreme to any state laws. But there's all this misunderstanding and all of this political junk that has seeped into our system as a result of people's shift in attitude towards the government. We no longer have these United States. We have the United States, this massive federal government, this oppressive in many ways federal government, and states have been defanged. Right? They have been, shown their role, that the abuser came in and threatened everybody, and now everyone cowers in silence because they don't want, to be beaten again. And so they're all just subservient slaves to their master. And that is the kind of role. I work in state politics. I've been around state legislators. I've seen the arguments they make. I've seen how scared they are of, federal backlash and losing federal funds and being sued and all the things. And so states have been defanged. What before was, these powerful states stepping forward to protect the constitutional rights of their citizens, including against the federal government, as in the case of the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions of 1798 against John Adams and the Alien and Sedition Acts. We don't really get that as much anymore from states, and it's because the cultural understanding of our government has shifted. We have lived for a century and a half under this oppressive, authoritarian, centralized federal nation state, and we've lost the Union. The Union was not preserved. It was not at all preserved. Lincoln did not free the slaves. He freed some for tactical political purposes. He was AWOL when the abolitionists were pushing for the 13th Amendment. Abe Lincoln himself had supported a prior 13th Amendment, which would have explicitly and forever codified in the Constitution the ability of states to maintain slavery legally. So he's not the great emancipator. He didn't free the slaves. He did not preserve the Union. He destroyed the Union. And what we have left today is quite different. And the fact that this divisive authoritarian is revered as benevolent and saintly and visionary it shows how much a mythology can be conjured up amongst a historically illiterate citizenry. So back to the question as we wrap up: why do Mormons revere Abraham Lincoln? Well, I think they revere him in large measure for two reasons. Number one, they've grown up reading textbooks and being taught by historians and history teachers and so forth that Lincoln was this great emancipator who preserved the Union, and also because the members of the church are taught by leaders of the church the same, who themselves, the leaders of the church, grew up on the same textbooks and teachers and historian perspectives and remarks about Abraham Lincoln. We are collectively the byproduct of the culture that we've been in, and that byproduct, in the aftermath of the war, the history of it has been written in a way to favor the outcome of Abraham Lincoln, to bury all of this opposing different stuff, contradictory arguments and so forth, and just say, well, the war settled it, and this is what's right, and might makes right, therefore Abraham Lincoln preserved the Union, and the southern states didn't leave, and as if like the geographical political connection of different lands has anything to do with it. It's about the principles. It's about the consent of the governed. And that was completely undermined. So our leaders in the church have been spoon-fed the same propaganda for a century and a half as the rest of us. And society has long embraced the cult of Lincoln and consequently imbued his actions with divine approbation, right? almost blessing this nationalist perspective in Union, claiming that God raised up Lincoln, as many church leaders said. They raised him up for this purpose, to battle for the liberties of mankind, to free the slaves, to preserve the Union. And in retrospect, it's been reverse engineered, even though people at the time, the historian testified as much to this in his biography, David Donald, I think his name was, that at the time, no one saw Lincoln that way. It was only in retrospect, after the war, to whitewash it, to justify it, this mass murder of innocent civilians across the country. In order to justify that, they had to kind of religiously undergird the actions of Abraham Lincoln, and in so doing, kind of quasi-deified this guy to be God's emissary to battle for the liberties of mankind, when he neither freed the slaves, as we might rationally understand that term, nor did he preserve the Union in any meaningful sense of the term, right? Is it true marriage if, the husband beats the wife and refuses for her to have any autonomy or to do anything that she wants, or to leave him at all? Like, that's a marriage in the hollowed out sense of the term. They are technically on paper married, but that's not truly a marriage in the functional, actual sense of two people coming together and uniting in furtherance of shared objectives. We do not have that union today. That union does not exist. It was killed in the war, along with what today would be over 8 million individuals. So, Lincoln said some nice things. He's caught in horrible circumstances, and I don't justify him by saying, he's a product of the circumstances and he did the best that he could do. I don't think that's true. Frederick Douglass testified as much to that he was not helping the abolitionists at all, that they were left out to dry and had to pursue their course on their own. He wanted to preserve the Union. He wanted to compel the Southern states to remain in this political relationship with the North. That was his objective, which I think is fundamentally violative of the sovereign authorities of the states and the rights of individuals to secede from governments that no longer protect their rights and serve their purposes. Even if I disagree with the reasons why, as in the Southern states, the English disagreed with the colonists seceding largely, and yet, we say that was okay. And the states seceded from the Articles of Confederation, and we say that was okay. Now, that's not to say that what the Southern states did was right, but so many of the people who fought in the South were not doing so because they championed slavery or had any slaves themselves. A lot of these people recognized in the battle the quest for self-determination, and that the Union was being oppressive by forcing them to remain in a relationship that they no longer wanted to, for varying reasons, not just because some wanted to perpetuate slavery. And that's also a moot point, because here the Union, and Abraham Lincoln was saying, we'll let you stay in the Union, and we'll even codify permanently in the Constitution your right to have slavery, which shows that the secession from the Southern states was not exclusively about slavery. They recognized in Lincoln's presidency and his actions and statements and those of his colleagues, greater threats, and both to slavery, but also to their self-determination. So it's a messy issue because it's tied up in slavery. The book I reference actually does a pretty good job of trying to disconnect that and say, let's look at the actual arguments themselves and knock them down one at a time. Abraham Lincoln has some good to him, but he has a lot of bad to him that would contextualize how people perceive him and treat him, which most historians and Steven Spielbergs of the world and textbooks and so forth do not do. They focus on this glorified pro-nationalist perspective that we've been spoon-fed for decades, that church leaders have grown up with, that church members have grown up with. And I think it's important to understand the truth. It's not to say he's this horrible, evil person in all respects. There are some redeeming qualities to him and so forth. But if his contemporaries weren't championing him, and only when history has been whitewashed and reverse engineered to favor the victors do we see this glorified, wonderful, heroic Lincoln, you have to question if that's true history or if it's been whitewashed and manipulated. Love to know what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next Sunday.